Hey, I'm Bryson with Trick Tools. This is episode 3 of our drag bike body series. At this point, we've covered the history of this project. We've given you tips on how to lay out and design a project like this and how to build a buck. In this episode, we're going to be showing you guys the basic sheet metal fabrication techniques, and that's going to include everything from tips on laying out your templates to some of the tools necessary to get started on a project like this. And then we're going to finish it off with basic sheet metal techniques, so stick around. So you've built your buck, and the next step is to lay out and make your panels for your project. The big question is, where do you get started? So I like to start with areas that are going to bring some structure and rigidity to the project. So we already discussed how the upper panels on this body were already started by Clay Cook. What I'm going to do is start where I would have wanted to had I started this project from the beginning. So what I'm going to do is start with the seat and lower side panel areas of the bike, and not only because they're flatter and a little bit less complex, but because that's where the mounting tabs are for the body on the lower section. So what that's going to do is allow us to build and join the upper pieces into the lower pieces and have a good solid place to mount from. So we're going to start with the side panels first and then work into the seat area. So let's get started. So for the seat and lower side panel areas, I'm going to be using a standard white poster board material that you can pretty much get at any office supply store. And the reason I like to use this as opposed to maybe some thinner paper or cardboard on a flat area is that this, compared to cardboard, is going to give you a nice clean edge that you can, once you cut your templates out, the edge is going to be nice and crisp. That way when you lay it on the metal, it's going to lay on there nicely, it's going to trace on there nicely. And obviously, as opposed to normal paper, this is a little bit thicker, a little sturdier, so for a flat area, it's going to lay flat on there better, hold its shape a little better for you as you're trying to shape it or trim it or what have you on the project itself. So yeah, we're going to start with this, and we'll start with our side panels and work from there. Okay, so what we've done here is laying the poster board material on here, trimmed out some of the edges to be able to clear some of the components that I want to clear. Basically, to get the paper to fold and lay up inside on this curve and then come up to the upper part, made little cuts all along here to allow the paper to relax. And actually what this has done is created little gaps in between the paper. And what that tells me by those gaps is that this is where, when this is metal, this is gonna have to be stretched. So obviously the paper is a similar thing to the metal in the way that it's gonna have to lay on here. It's gonna have to stretch to be able to, not to be able to sweep up like this, but to match the curve that this has from front to back, which is you know, kind of a real subtle, gradual curve around the edge here. So in the same way, if these cuts in the paper cause the paper to lay over the top of each other, that would mean that essentially it needs to be shrink. So yeah, right now these all have gaps in them. So and as we work around the corner, you can really see some of the gaps in here. So there's going to be a lot of stretching going on to take what's going to be starting out as a flat panel and get it to stretch and lay around here. And the reason you do that, like I said, is it kind of tells you what needs to happen in the metal a little bit. But you can use, and you know that, all right, this section of paper lays on here like I want it. And so once I need to work it, I'm going to have to bend it up. I'm gonna have to stretch this a little bit to start getting this curve in here, and then once I start curving it around, I'm gonna have to stretch quite a bit to get it to tuck back in this corner area here. And then once we get this made and in place, we're gonna make the templates for here and then over the seat section, and then we'll join those together right in this area. So, and then eventually these will all get trimmed a little shorter, you know, depending on how exactly we're gonna have this flow. But I like to make my templates a little big to at least get the main shapes in place. And then, you know, from there, once they get the metal made and shaped, you know, where you like it up here, where you need it, then you can come back in and mark where you want to trim, how you want your edges to look, and then trim it from there. So I like to leave my templates a little long. Some people like to make them exact. There's no right or wrong on that. If you leave it long, you know you have a little extra material you can work with if need be. So we got this on here. We're going to take this off. And this template will also should work for the other side. And basically the way I do things is if I make a template for one side and I have to duplicate the side on the other, but in a reverse, I'll use the same template. That way, in theory, you're making the same part just twice in reverse, and you can go from there. So yeah, we're gonna take this off. I'll probably test fit it on the other side and make sure everything's right, make sure I don't have to tweak anything that I can do to both sides. And once I get to that point, we'll lay it flat on some sheet metal, we'll trace it out, we'll cut it out, and we'll start shaping. All right, so we've taken the template off of our buck. We test fit it on the other side to make sure it's gonna work, and it is. So we're gonna lay it here on our aluminum, we're gonna trace it out, we're gonna cut it out, and then we'll also cut out a second one that we'll use on the other side, and then we'll get to shaping them. All right, so now we have two panels cut, and we did that using the Beverly shear here. And because the shear causes a little distortion in these panels when you cut them, we ran it through the planishing hammer and then through the shrinker stretcher just to tighten the edges back up. So now that we have these cut, we're gonna start fitting them to the buck, and we'll show you the techniques we're gonna use to get that done. All right, so obviously our panel is flat right at the moment, but you can kind of see where this is gonna belong here on the side. And what we're gonna do is initially here, we're gonna put a bend in it that's gonna kind of follow this line here, which is gonna follow the bend out in the wires of the buck here. So we'll get this bent to be able to lay it flat against this surface here to where it's coming out. And then we'll see what we need to do to start wrapping the edges around to be able to tuck it into the buck on both ends here. And we'll go from there. So before we get to shaping metal, I'm going to explain to you guys a little bit of the things that you can do to shape metal. So essentially with metal, you can do 5 things, and that's cut it, weld it, bend it, shrink it, and stretch it. And the last 3 of those, the bending, shrinking, and stretching, are the fundamentals of actually getting to shape metal. So if you look at these 2 demo pieces I have here, first of all, on this one, you know, in order to get a crown in a panel like this, if this was flat, in order to get this to have this nice dome shape, there's 2 things you can do to start moving it in that direction. And the first one would be to stretch it. So you could run this through a hammer, an English wheel, that sort of thing, and you would start to bring up the middle of this by stretching all this out to create this dome shape. The second thing would be to shrink it. So if this was flat again, if you started shrinking all around the edge here, it would start to pull the metal down because it's tightening up the edge. So when you put this in a shrinker stretcher machine, they have upper and lower jaws, and the jaw plates are separated. So when they squeeze on the metal, they pull it together. And that essentially is going to shrink the metal together and start pulling the edge down. So a piece like this has been done by utilizing both of those techniques together. So it was some stretching done to start to get the dome shape. We started to shrink around the edge to be able to pull it in a little tighter and start to really create this dome shape. So essentially this is both shrinking and stretching. If you have a flange, so we bent this 90-degree flange here to show off the capabilities of a shrinker stretcher, and essentially in this area where it's curved this way, all of this in here was used on a shrinker, so it was pulling the metal together, which started to bend this around that direction. So exact opposite from here around. This was put in the stretcher, so as the jaws came down, they're together and then they push apart, which then pushes the metal apart too. It pulls it and stretches it out. So essentially that's how the shrinking and stretching works. Most of your metal shaping tools are just different versions of shrinking and stretching and bending as well. So obviously, you know, a 90-degree like this was done in a sheet metal brake, so you just bend it straight over. And then obviously, you know, the cutting and welding, if you're trying to fit 2 pieces together, you cut it, you weld it, you metal finish it out, that sort of thing. So that's kind of the basics of what makes metal move, and with that we'll get to shaping. All right, so what we've done is put a small kink or bend here in the piece of aluminum we have for this panel. So we laid this out on here basically just to get this line started. So obviously this is still a flat straight panel front to back. But what we're going to do now is start to stretch this upper flange. And what that's going to do by stretching this, it's going to start to put a curve in it that's going to follow the shape of the curve of the buck here. So basically in doing that, it's going to start to tuck the front part of the panel here into the buck. And then as that starts to go around, we'll continue to stretch this and, you know, get it to wrap around this front shape of the buck here. So like I said, we're gonna start by stretching this and working it, and basically this section here for the most part is going to stay flat, or we want it to stay flat. So it's going to lay on here. We do want this to kind of start taking a little bit of curve in this area up here in the front, basically like right at this point. So it's going to kind of wrap in right here. So yeah, we're going to start by stretching this. To do that, I'm going to be using shrinker stretcher. We're going to start with the stretching jaws to just put a little bit of stretch in here. If we need to, we'll English wheel it a little bit with a pretty flat die to put more stretch in it without actually stretching the metal in little parts. We'll stretch it all evenly. And if you remember, based on the template, you know, we had all the cuts in the paper and there was gaps in each one. So with those gaps, you know, that's where we needed the metal to stretch. So we're going to stretch that out and get it to wrap around. So we'll get on the shrinker stretcher here and start moving this metal. So what we have here is 3 different models of shrinker stretchers that we offer. And this one here is our metal lace unit, which utilizes the shrinker and stretcher that are the Lancaster style, mounted on a pedestal with foot pedals on them. for easy foot operation. This is the JS Tools Shrinker Stretcher. Foot pedal operation again. These are both manual, so anytime you want to put pressure on them, you have to, manually use your leg to put pressure down on your part. So these ones basically just have the jaw depth through the throat. This JS Tools one has a 6-inch throat depth, so you can get in deeper on a panel. This machine here is the Echold KF170. This is an air-operated machine, so you put your foot on the pedal and the machine does the work by itself. You don't have to physically, push down on it every time. Using, standing on one leg and all that to, this allows you to have a little better balance. This is for really serious metal shapers who are, going to be doing daily heavy shrinking, stretching use. And this is also capable of some other things beyond shrinking and stretching, whereas these other two aren't. So that's kind of a basic walkthrough of our shrinker stretchers that are available. I'm going to be using mostly the 170 here just to speed up some process, but we'll jump on these other two a little bit just to show how they work as well. All right, so I'm actually going to have to shrink a little deeper on this. That way, because this has such a deep flange, and this is actually more of a roll, it's going to be harder to get it to kind of bend this roll area a little bit. So what I'm going to do is stretch a little deeper into here. That way all of this material is stretching evenly. Once I get this a couple more passes on here, I'm going to jump over to the English wheel real quick. And then after that, I'll jump over to the JS and show you a little bit how that works, because I'll have to stretch a little more probably after that. So. All right, so this is our Metal Ace 30F English wheel. It's a 30-inch throat depth, so that's where the 30F comes from. So this one has an 8-inch upper wheel and a 3-inch lower wheel, 3-inch diameter as well as 3 inches wide on both of these. It's got a quick release lever here. It's foot operated easily. So as you're wheeling, if you need a little more tension, this moves it up and down real nicely. So we have an optional 2-inch die rack on here. We're going to be using our 3-inch anvils here. This one's probably a little tight for it, so what I'm going to do is go ahead and swap this one out, and we'll go to a lower crown, lower anvil here. Just going to run it through a little bit on this panel here to really stretch some more, start to put some curve in it. We were just trying to basically loosen up this metal a little bit on the shrinker stretcher to be able to wheel this a little easier. Like I said, once I get done with this and we kind of start to see the shape coming into it, I'll jump over and show you a little bit on the JS Tool Shrinker. But yeah, we'll get to wheeling here. Like I said, easily adjustable by foot. Even when you're wheeling, if you want a little more pressure, you can kick it with your foot here. And I'm actually pulling a little bit of pressure down as I'm pulling it out. And that way it'll actually start to help roll this flange a little bit, put a little more crown in it this way. So a little bit of down pressure, not much. All right, so now that I've done a little bit of wheeling on this, I'm gonna continue to wheel, but I'm gonna come at it from the other side just to get a little more leverage as I'm pulling down on this end here to, like I said, get the crown going in this section here. So I'm gonna keep wheeling from this side. A little bit of down pressure. So you can see now that this is starting to take some crown in this way, and this buck it's not going to need a whole lot in this back section. So we're going to go test fit it here and see where we're at. And as we need to, we'll come back and shrink and stretch. The next time we'll jump on a stretcher, I'll show you the JS tools. All right, so now we can test fit this panel on here, and you can see that it's starting to get some curve that we want in it this way. But what's going to happen is in the back here, this is actually going to need to lay down more. So this is going to bend more flat this way in the back section, and then as it goes forward, it's going to kind of lay up a little bit less of an angle in the front. So what I'm going to do to get this to lay down, leave this where it's at, is I'm going to use a T-dolly, and I'm going to just by hand put some pressure on this to bend this down a little more. We'll keep test fitting it until we get it a little closer. We're gonna have to keep stretching on this a little bit to, as this lays down, this is gonna wanna flatten out. So as I lay this down, we're gonna keep stretching on this to keep the curve in here. Once we get the back fitting pretty much like we'd like it, then we'll start moving towards the front to get this to wrap around here. So these are just part of a basic set of straight T-dollies from Metal Ace. It's always good to have a tool like this around that you can use to obviously hammer over, bend some metal over. You know, part of shaping metal is not just running it in a machine, but sometimes you gotta, you know, use your own strength to bend something a little bit, tweak it. You know, the machine is gonna get it as good as you can get it in a machine, but once you're fitting it on your part on your project, sometimes you just need a little load here, tweak there. I use T-dollies a lot to be able to tweak over you know, a shape or modify it a little bit. Yeah, so metal shaping is not above, you know, some hand forming at that aspect of it. So get yourself a good set of T-dollies and it'll really help you out. So we're gonna keep shaping this piece, and then we'll fit it back on the bike and work from there. Okay, so we're getting it to have that angle we're looking for in here. As you can see by pressing this over a little bit, it's kind of flattened this out, even gone the other direction a little bit. So we're gonna stretch on this more to put some more material in this area. We'll get this to continue with this radius that we're looking for to fit around here. And if we need to, we'll come back in and tweak this down a little bit. Once we get, like I said, once we get this fitting in this area like we like it, then we're going to work on the front section and get this to wrap around the front. So like I had stated with this panel, once I started to tip this over a little harder to get it to fit the buck back in this section the way I liked it, it starts to appear to flatten this out a little bit, and that's mainly because as this bend is hard here but softer here, basically it needs to stretch to have more material in here to keep that curve. So this is the JS Tools shrinker, and I'm gonna use the aluminum soft jaws that they make for it to stretch out this area here and continue this curve going. So. So you can see actually what it's done now that I've stretched this out more is it's really putting a bow in it the opposite direction. So what I'm gonna do is go back over to the T-dolly. We're gonna push this over a little bit to get this shape to come back to the other side, and then we'll keep working from there. All right, so we've got the piece clamped back in place here where we like it. You can see that this is really starting to fit the buck nicely right in this section. We still need to pull this back in a little bit. It's actually laying on the buck pretty much up until this wire right in here, which that's the point where we really need this to start taking a lot more shape and curve back into the buck. So we will have to barely pull this upper side of this in just a little bit to lay it up against the buck. But we're really gonna start, finding the shape around here now. So we'll keep working in that direction. All right, so you can see as we've stretched a lot in here that this is really starting to take a nice curve around the side here. So we have a little more stretching to do, and once we get there, this piece is gonna be pretty much done, minus trimming up the bottom here. We're gonna put a little step bead in here where the lower panel is gonna meet up with it, and then we'll trim up the back side, and then obviously we have to fit this to the top. But for right now, this piece is just about finished, so we're gonna keep stretching and get it exactly where we like it, and then we'll move on to the seat area. Now that we have the upper side panel in place, we're going to use that as a stopping point to get us to part 2. Hopefully in this part, you've been able to gain a basic understanding of some of the things that are necessary to start shaping metal. And in part 2, we're going to continue with the seat area and the lower side panel sections. And we'll continue talking about some of the things that are necessary to get you going on a shaping project, and some of the things that you need to do or some of the tools you need to acquire to be able to keep shaping metal. So look out for part 2 coming very soon, and we'll see you then.